Somewhere beneath the harsh businessman existed the father he once admired. Occasionally Ethan wondered if things could still change. He imagined a conversation where Richard finally listened. A conversation where titles, degrees, and achievements no longer mattered. But those hopes faded each time they met. Richard never asked questions about Ethan's work. He never showed curiosity about his life. Every interaction felt trapped in the same pattern established years earlier. Then one morning, everything shifted unexpectedly. Ethan received a report from his executive team regarding a potential acquisition opportunity. A well-known company was experiencing serious financial difficulties. The business possessed valuable assets but suffered from poor strategic decisions and mounting debt. Acquiring a controlling stake could create significant opportunities. Ethan reviewed the report casually at first. Then he noticed the company name. His heart stopped. It belonged to Richard Blackwell. He read the report again, certain he had misunderstood, but the information was accurate. His father's empire was in trouble. Years of risky investments and changing market conditions had weakened the organization. Revenue was declining. Investors were concerned. Banks were becoming nervous. For the first time in decades, Richard's business faced genuine uncertainty. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared through the office window. Thousands of thoughts rushed through his mind. Part of him felt sympathy. Another part felt anger. Memories of public humiliation resurfaced. So did memories of childhood disappointment. Yet beneath those emotions existed something deeper. Sadness. He never wanted to see his father suffer. Even after everything that had happened, he couldn't erase the bond between them. Later that evening, Ethan remained alone in the office long after everyone else left. The city lights shimmered outside the glass walls as he considered the situation. Fate had created an extraordinary irony. The son labeled worthless now possessed the power to save the father who had spent years mocking him. He knew the decision before he consciously made it. He would help. Not because Richard deserved it, not because he needed validation, and certainly not because he had forgotten the pain. He would help because he refused to become the kind of person bitterness could control. However, before offering assistance, there was one thing Ethan wanted. He wanted his father to finally see the truth. Not the version shaped by assumptions and prejudice, not the story built around degrees and appearances. He wanted Richard to meet the person his son had become. And soon, that opportunity would arrive in a way neither of them could possibly expect. Richard Blackwell had spent most of his life believing that success made a person untouchable. For decades, he had built his business empire with confidence, discipline, and relentless ambition. He was respected by competitors, admired by investors, and feared by rivals. Whenever people spoke about him, they described him as a man who never lost. That reputation became such a large part of his identity that he eventually started believing failure was something that happened only to other people. For years, every major decision seemed to work in his favor. New investments generated profits. Business expansions opened fresh opportunities. Partnerships strengthened his influence. Each victory reinforced his confidence. Unfortunately, confidence slowly transformed into arrogance. Richard stopped listening to advice. He ignored warnings from trusted executives. He dismissed concerns raised by financial analysts. Whenever someone questioned his judgment, he viewed it as a challenge to his authority rather than valuable feedback. The first signs of trouble appeared gradually. A large investment in an ambitious development project failed to produce expected returns. Richard remained calm. One setback couldn't threaten an empire he had spent decades building. Then a second investment underperformed. Shortly afterward, a major client unexpectedly ended a long-term contract. The losses began accumulating faster than anyone anticipated. Several executives urged Richard to adjust the company's strategy before the situation worsened. He refused. He believed the market would eventually correct itself. He believed his instincts were still superior. Most importantly, he believed admitting mistakes would make him appear weak. Months passed. Conditions continued deteriorating. Revenue declined. Operating costs increased. Investors became concerned. Competitors gained market share. The company that once seemed unstoppable suddenly looked vulnerable. Richard still refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Publicly, he maintained the same confident image that had served him for years. He smiled during interviews. He reassured shareholders. He dismissed rumors. But behind closed doors, pressure was mounting. Every morning brought new problems. Every meeting revealed fresh challenges. Every financial report contained more bad news than the one before it. For the first time in his career, Richard found himself struggling to control events. The situation became impossible to ignore when banks began questioning the company's financial stability. Loans that had once been easy to secure now required additional scrutiny. Lenders demanded detailed explanations. Credit conditions tightened. Investors requested emergency meetings. Richard spent countless hours trying to reassure people that everything remained under control. Yet even he no longer fully believed it. The stress affected every aspect of his life. He slept poorly. His temper became shorter. Conversations with colleagues often ended in arguments. Employees who had worked beside him for years noticed the changes. Some quietly began searching for new opportunities. Others remained loyal but worried about the future. At home, the atmosphere grew tense. Richard's wife, Margaret, observed the decline with increasing concern. She had spent decades supporting her husband through challenges, but this situation felt different. There was fear in his eyes now. Fear he tried desperately to hide. One evening, she found him sitting alone in his office staring at financial reports spread across his desk. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock. "You should get some rest," she said gently. Richard rubbed his forehead. "I don't have time for rest." Margaret sat beside him. "Then at least talk to someone. You don't have to carry everything alone." Richard laughed bitterly. "Talk to who?" The question lingered in the air. Margaret wanted to say Ethan. She wanted to remind him that their younger son possessed intelligence, determination, and compassion, but years of family tension made the subject difficult. Richard had spent so long dismissing Ethan that even mentioning his name sometimes triggered irritation. So she remained silent. Richard returned his attention to the reports. Deep down, he knew the situation was becoming dangerous. What he didn't realize was how quickly things would worsen. Within weeks, several major investors withdrew support. News of the company's financial struggles spread throughout the industry. Journalists began asking difficult questions. Competitors exploited the uncertainty. Clients hesitated to sign new agreements. The empire Richard had spent a lifetime constructing suddenly resembled a building developing cracks in its foundation. Every day brought another piece of bad news. The pressure became unbearable. Then came the moment Richard feared most. His chief financial officer entered his office carrying a folder and a grim expression. Richard immediately sensed trouble. "How bad is it?" he asked. The executive placed the folder on the desk. "Worse than we expected." Richard opened the documents and reviewed the figures. His face slowly lost color. The numbers confirmed what he had been avoiding for months. Without immediate intervention, the company faced a genuine risk of collapse. Richard closed the folder and stared out the window. For several moments neither man spoke. Finally, the executive broke the silence. "There may be one option." Richard turned toward him. "What option? An acquisition or major investment partnership?" Richard disliked the idea instantly. Throughout his career, he had always been the buyer, never the one seeking rescue. The thought wounded his pride, yet pride no longer mattered. "Survival did. Find potential investors," he said quietly. The search began immediately. Investment firms, private equity groups, and strategic partners were contacted. Meetings were arranged. Negotiations started. Some organizations expressed interest but offered disappointing terms. Others rejected involvement entirely. Richard quickly learned a painful lesson. The business world admired success, but it rarely showed sympathy for weakness. People who once praised his leadership suddenly treated him as a risk. Friends became distant. Former allies stopped returning calls. Relationships he believed were built on loyalty revealed themselves to be transactions disguised as friendships. The realization hurt more than he expected. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult meeting, Richard sat alone in a conference room reflecting on his life. For the first time in years, memories unrelated to business surfaced. He thought about his children, he thought about Daniel's achievements, then unexpectedly he thought about Ethan. He remembered the birthday celebration months earlier. He remembered calling his son worthless in front of dozens of guests. At the time, he had viewed the comment as harmless truth. Now the memory made him uncomfortable. Margaret had criticized him afterward. Daniel had looked disappointed. Even some guests had appeared shocked. Richard tried dismissing the guilt, but it lingered. Why? Because beneath all the financial pressure, a troubling question had begun forming in his mind. What if he had been wrong about Ethan? The thought seemed absurd initially, yet it refused to disappear. He realized he knew almost nothing about his younger son's life. Years had passed without meaningful conversations. He didn't know Ethan's goals, challenges, relationships, or accomplishments. He only knew the version he had created in his own mind. The realization unsettled him. Before he could explore the thought further, another development changed everything. His advisors informed him that a powerful international investment group had expressed serious interest in acquiring a controlling stake in the company. Unlike previous offers, this proposal was substantial. The financial resources involved could stabilize operations, satisfy creditors, and restore confidence among investors. It represented the best opportunity they had received. Richard immediately approved further discussions. Over the following weeks, negotiations progressed rapidly. The investment group remained professional but mysterious. Their representatives revealed little about leadership. Most communication occurred through lawyers and senior executives. Despite repeated requests, Richard never met the individual ultimately responsible for the offer. The secrecy intrigued him. Whoever controlled the organization clearly possessed enormous resources. The proposed investment exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. Such wealth implied significant influence and experience. Richard assumed he would eventually meet a veteran billionaire or corporate titan. As negotiations approached completion, a final boardroom meeting was scheduled. During this session, the investment group's leadership would formally present acquisition terms and answer remaining questions. Richard viewed the meeting as a turning point. If everything proceeded smoothly, his company might survive. If not, the future looked uncertain. On the morning of the meeting, he arrived early. Despite weeks of preparation, anxiety weighed heavily on him. He reviewed documents repeatedly. He rehearsed key discussion points. He wanted to appear confident and capable. Even now, part of him feared appearing vulnerable. One by one, executives entered the building. Advisors prepared presentations. Legal teams organized paperwork. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Finally, a representative from the investment group informed Richard that the leadership team had arrived. "They're waiting in the boardroom," the representative said. Richard straightened his jacket and took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that could determine the future of everything he had built. He walked confidently toward the boardroom accompanied by several senior executives. As he approached the door, he imagined the conversation ahead. He expected difficult negotiations. He expected questions about strategy and performance. He expected to meet a powerful stranger capable of saving his company. What he did not expect was the truth waiting on the other side. The boardroom door opened. Richard stepped inside. For a brief second, nothing made sense. The room contained several executives seated around a long table. At the far end sat a man in a dark suit. Calm, composed, familiar. Richard stopped walking. His heartbeat seemed to vanish. Every sound disappeared. He stared at the figure, unable to process what he was seeing. The man slowly looked up from a folder and met his gaze. It was Ethan, his son, the same son he had mocked, the same son he had dismissed, the same son he had called uneducated and worthless. For several endless seconds, nobody spoke. Richard's mind struggled to reconcile reality with everything he believed. How could Ethan be here? Why was he sitting at the head of the table? Why did every executive seem to be looking toward him with respect? Confusion quickly transformed into shock. Then shock became disbelief. Richard glanced around the room searching for an explanation. None appeared. The evidence stood directly in front of him. Ethan wasn't attending the meeting as a guest. He wasn't there as an observer. He wasn't there as an employee. He was leading it. The realization hit with overwhelming force. Every insult Richard had ever spoken suddenly echoed through his memory. Every dismissal, every comparison, every cruel remark. They returned one after another like ghosts demanding acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Ethan remained calm. There was no anger in his expression, no arrogance, no satisfaction, only quiet confidence. Finally, he offered a polite smile and gestured toward an empty chair. "Good morning, Dad," he said calmly. "Please have a seat." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. The room remained silent as he slowly moved toward the table. Every step felt unreal. For the first time in his life, the man who always had answers found himself completely speechless. And deep inside, he sensed that the next few hours would force him to confront a truth he had spent years refusing to see. Richard Blackwell lowered himself into the chair with trembling hands. For the first time in decades, he felt completely unprepared for a meeting. The boardroom that had once felt like familiar territory suddenly seemed foreign. His mind struggled to process the reality in front of him. Ethan sat calmly at the head of the table, surrounded by executives who treated him with the respect normally reserved for industry leaders. Richard looked around the room again, hoping he had misunderstood something, but every detail confirmed the truth. The representatives from the investment group deferred to Ethan. The legal teams waited for his instructions. The executives watched him with confidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. His son was in charge, the son he had spent years dismissing, the son he had called uneducated and worthless. Ethan opened a folder and smiled politely. "Thank you for coming, everyone," he said. His voice was calm and professional. Richard barely recognized it. There was confidence in his words, authority, experience, qualities Richard had never allowed himself to see. Ethan began reviewing financial reports and acquisition documents. As he spoke, charts appeared on large screens around the room: revenue projections, market analysis, strategic opportunities. Every presentation demonstrated a level of expertise that left Richard stunned. Ethan wasn't simply participating in the discussion, he was leading it with remarkable skill. Questions from board members were answered clearly. Complex financial issues were explained effortlessly. Future growth plans were outlined with precision. The more Richard listened, the more uncomfortable he became. For years, he had convinced himself that Ethan lacked discipline, intelligence, and ambition, yet everything happening inside that room proved the exact opposite. Eventually, one of the executives stood and began presenting the history of the investment group. Richard listened carefully. What he learned felt almost impossible to believe. The organization had started as a small technology company years earlier. Despite limited resources and numerous obstacles, it had expanded rapidly across international markets. Revenue growth had shattered industry expectations. Major corporations relied on its software. Global investors competed for partnership opportunities. The company was now valued at several $billion. Richard stared at the screen as figures appeared one after another. The numbers exceeded anything he imagined. His own business, despite decades of work, was worth only a fraction of what Ethan's company had become. Then the executive displayed a photograph. It showed Ethan standing beside employees during the company's early years. Behind them was a tiny office with worn furniture and outdated computers. "This was our first headquarters," the executive said proudly. "At the time, we had almost no resources. Most people believed we would fail, but our founder never stopped believing." Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. He remembered those years. He remembered mocking Ethan's decision to leave university. He remembered dismissing his dreams as unrealistic fantasies. While he was criticizing his son, Ethan had been building an empire. Maury photos appeared, small teams working late into the night. Early product launches, international expansion announcements, award ceremonies, industry conferences. Every image revealed another chapter of a journey Richard knew nothing about. The realization was devastating. He hadn't merely underestimated Ethan, he had completely ignored his life. Years had passed without genuine curiosity. Years without asking meaningful questions. Years without offering support. He had judged his son based on assumptions rather than facts. The meeting continued. Ethan discussed future plans for Richard's company. The acquisition proposal was generous. Employees would keep their jobs, operations would continue, existing clients would be protected. Ethan had designed the deal to preserve everything Richard had spent decades building. That fact confused him. After everything he had done, why would Ethan help? Why not walk away? Why not let the company collapse? Why not take revenge? Richard found himself unable to focus on the discussion anymore. His thoughts drifted through memories he had avoided for years. He remembered Ethan as a child sitting proudly at the kitchen table with a school project. Richard had barely glanced at it because he was busy preparing for a business meeting. He remembered Ethan winning a local competition and rushing home excited to share the news. Richard had responded by asking why he hadn't won a larger competition instead. He remembered family dinners where Daniel's accomplishments dominated conversations while Ethan sat quietly listening. At the time, Richard believed he was motivating his son. Now he realized he had been hurting him. The meeting eventually reached its conclusion. Contracts were prepared. Final questions were answered.